So good afternoon and welcome to another HR Grapevine podcast. Today I am joined by Rob Williams, Business Development Director at AdviserPlus, and Ian Renwick, Employee Relations and Insights Manager at Flybe. We all know that employee relations is an important topic, but can get lost when we talk about all the other things that are transforming in HR, such as digital channels, the nature of engagement, agile modes of working. It can all get a bit muddled. However, it's crucial can actually hold together and drive all of these facets. In fact, the most forward-thinking HR practitioners are using employee relations to drive their HR transformation. To find out how they're doing so and to understand how you should properly view some of the fundamental aspects of this, over the next 45 minutes or so, Ian and Rob will be talking about how ER is viewed, both generally and from a leadership perspective, how ER is often used rightly or wrongly, and what enabled managers and technology might need for ER or what they have ER. So before I hand over to the actual experts, we'll be running polls as usual. So please get involved with those. Use the question function in GoToWebinar to put your burning interrogatives to the experts that we have on hand today. And as ever, if your connection goes down or you have to shoot off before the end, we will be sending out a recording. So please watch out for that in your inbox. So, without any further ado, over to Rob and Ian.
Dan, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. As per Dan's introduction, my name is Rob Williams. I'm Business Development Director of AdviserPlus. AdviserPlus, for the last 15 years, have been working with HR directors to help them deliver value from their employee relations functions. Over the last 15 years, we've built the largest qualified ER advisor team in the UK. And we've developed a number of digital tools that support both line managers and HR with effective case management. We've also seen the evolution of a data analytics practice over the last 5 or 6 years, which is able to augment business data with HR data, which supports us in identifying the priority areas where high impact delivery can take place. We're joined today, I'm very pleased to welcome Ian Renwick from Flybe, the Employee Relations and Insights Manager. Welcome, Ian.
Good afternoon, Rob.
And I thought what would be a really good way of starting off the session today would be to talk about what's changing in HR, certainly from some of the experiences we've had at AdviserPlus and how we've been working with a number of consultancies and experts and influencers. And here are some of the key themes, and it'd be interesting to understand whether Flybe has experienced the same sorts of things. Agile HR is something that comes up quite often, and there are different definitions of it. But at AdviserPlus, we see Agile HR as high impact, cross-functional teams, project managers, representatives from the business working together with HR in local areas on core, high impact, high priority areas that are separating activities between running and growing the business. So that standardization and simplification of transactional activities, but ensuring that HR resources are prioritized on that higher impact work. We're also seeing as business strategy becomes more short term and there's more pressure to deliver results in quicker timelines, HR having to be much more agile, less siloed, a much broader skill set. We're also seeing a huge amount of change, which isn't going to surprise anybody who's listening, in whatever guise it is, whether it's mergers and acquisitions, rapid growth due to huge investment, movements into new markets and territories, and adjusting to meet changing operating models as we see traditional approaches to delivery being disruptive, and that use of data from across the business, much more sort of data scientists as part of the core team using analysis and correlation of data to look at where those insights are happening, so the cause, cost and consequences of specific HR processes. And we're seeing managers take on a bigger role as well. So being enabled with more tools and support from HR to be able to carry out what they're doing in a way that isn't disrupting the business, but equally is giving them more ownership over that local decision making when it comes to employees, as well as the obligatory, I think, challenges around doing more for less, reducing costs and delivering more sort of value for money evidence. And that changing workforce, as we see a younger workforce with different preferences, the impacts of digitalisation and that changing skills base. A huge mix there, I'm sure you'll appreciate.
There's a lot to unpick there for sure.
It is. So what's your experience of that in Flybe at the moment?
Look, I mean, yeah, without getting too bogged down in every single one of those details, I think all of those things could potentially be true, and hopefully a little bit more. You know, my background is fairly wide remit, if you like. I've had a fairly comprehensive HR background across a range of different fields, and ER has sort of touched across a lot of things. I've worked with Flybe, I've worked for another airline, and I've worked for large multinationals as well. And all of those things are transforming faster now than I've certainly seen in the last sort of 10 or 15 years. And you mentioned agile HR, and I think agile is a great place to start. And if we think about it in terms of the broader business perspective and not just HR, I think that's where your real value lies. And we talk about breaking down silos, and breaking down silos. If you've got a large organization in between, I don't know, the BP area, the reward benefit area, the recruitment area, the training area, that's your starting point. But really, if HR isn't thinking a little bit more cross-functional in terms of collaborating with IT, collaborating with finance, with marketing, all of these kinds of things in terms of building that business and solving business problems collaboratively, then what is the future of HR without all of those things? And I think, yes, the demographics are changing. People's careers are changing. The whole world of work in many senses is changing. I was fortunate enough to go to, and we were talking about this earlier, Rob, to go to Unleash, a really very good future of work HR tech conference. They happen around the world, and this one was in Paris just a few weeks ago. And they were talking about the inherent instability of the world and the last 3 to 5 years that we've seen, all kinds of geopolitical, economic changes that we haven't really seen for quite some time. And fundamentally, there's two main things that people have in their lives. One is their family, and one is their friends, and the social element of that. You may have an element of feeling part of something bigger, perhaps your local region, your town, your country, perhaps. But then fundamentally, you also quite often go to work, and that relationship between yourself, i.e., the employee, and the employer, it's such a touching point. It's such a grounding point for so many people. And HR's role in shaping that relationship and allowing people to continue to have that sense of identity and purpose in their entire life when everything else around them seems to be going, to hell, if you like. I fundamentally see that HR's role in that is ever more important. And it'll be fascinating to see how many companies and how many CHROs and CEOs are thinking in those terms, not just about the success of their business, but fundamentally the success of their business being driven by the people that are with them. And ER and employee engagement and all those elements are so important to have that.
And as we move to the next slide, I mean, that sort of future vision of HR is very interesting. Where would you say, if you've reached that point in maturity, you would be on something like the burst-in model, which we used at the roundtable workshop we did with a number of HR directors and ER practitioners a few weeks ago, as a standard of progress in terms of HR maturity? Where would the, I guess, utopian view of HR fit within this model?
I mean, a lot of this stuff, and we had this conversation. I was there at that roundtable. It was really, really useful. A lot of this stuff we in our discussions was, you're not necessarily going to get rid of some of these things. You're not necessarily going to stop doing them. Somebody has to do some of these things, in terms of the control, the serving staff, or the automation elements, the operational pieces. Somebody has to do that now. As tech develops, you're hoping to be able to automate that a lot more, much more. I need an update to my leave. I need an update to this. I'll literally just send it into a bot, and the bot will be able to do that for me and update my contract. Fine. So the more you can do all of that stuff, you are progressing up those levels. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be looking at ways to make those operational pieces better. That, again, every single touch point, and we'll talk about this throughout this talk, I think, today, in terms of every single touch point being an opportunity for great employee engagement, and ER is a huge part of that. Whether you consider that, that contract signing, that I've got a problem, that help me out with my leave. All of those kinds of things are incredible opportunities. But yes, you're right. Your utopia, if you like, you're driving towards that business-driven HR. I would almost put it the other way around, HR-driven business. Where you're saying we're putting our employees front and center, and they are the decisions that we make that impact our employees are the ones that are effectively impacting upon our customers. So I think that's where we're hopefully driving towards.
Excellent. And when we look at this change, we talked a lot about it being about process transformation and digitalisation. How much does technology really have to play in driving this thrust of maturity?
It is inevitable in many senses. The tools and the models and everything else are getting better and more numerous, and the choices out there are exponential compared to what they were, exponentially grown as opposed to where they were even 5 years ago. That doesn't mean that there's, just because you haven't got that tech that you can't do something better. Tech is only good as the process that you put into it. Fundamentally, it's a tool like everything else. So if you don't have those good processes and you don't know what you want that tech to do for you, it ain't going to help you that much. So fundamentally, it's still about understanding what that relationship is between the employer and employee, which is going to create that difference. You can have great out-of-the-box systems. You can have you think about you want to model something on Google or one of the really well-known players in this kind of area. That's not necessarily going to work well for your culture. You have to understand fundamentally what your business does well, what you want of your employees, and what effectively your employees can demand of you as well at the same time. So all the tech in the world isn't going to change that. You still have to have that business mind or that experience mind to be able to get the most out of that.
Excellent. And the interesting point that came out of that workshop was there were sort of 4 pillars, if you like, to maturity in most elements of transformation in the business generally. But HR has something different, doesn't it? So we talked about efficiency, we talked about simplicity, we talked about analysis and improved use of data, and we talked about engagement, which you've touched upon already. But HR has that other thing that we shouldn't overlook, which is assurance. What do you make of that? And is that something that you find when making decisions around change in Flybe that you can't overlook that assurance aspect?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's one of those key elements, and it's underpinned. In fact, when we relaunched the employee relations team, we're a fairly new team. We had the employee relations function with us in de facto, if you like, for a number of years, but there wasn't an employee relations team until about 6 months ago. And we built that based upon those core principles of consistency, fairness, assurance, if you like, not just in terms of managing that legal risk potentially, but also managing, again, that consistent relationship with your employee. Fundamentally, what's boiling it down into its core principles, what an employee wants to know is my job safe? Am I going to be treated fairly? Am I going to get paid correctly at the end of every month or every 2 weeks or however else you get paid? And if I have any problems, will they get listened to and dealt with fairly? It's the same as questions that we would have in any civil society, if you like, except it's on a smaller scale with the employee-employer relationship. So fundamentally, it's a crucial part of that. It's almost a building block upon everything else is founded. Without that assurance, what's the point of having all these great employee engagement surveys and all the rest of it if you can't feel that your problems and your concerns are being dealt with in a consistent, fair manner?
On the point of assurance as well, is there something in this that suggests that employee relations is kind of there's almost a binary element to it? If bad advice happens or something goes wrong, the repercussions for organisations in terms of their profile, the impact on employees are there, as opposed to something in learning and development or recruitment. If you make a bad hire or the learning and development isn't necessarily delivering what it needs, the employee relations has that impact if it goes wrong. Much far-reaching consequences.
You may be right, and I think we'll touch on this a little bit later, but I wish it wasn't binary. I wish it wasn't, in many senses, us versus them. And that whole mentality of, we're either right or you're wrong in your grievance, or you're either right or you're wrong in your disciplinary, it's very much treated in many companies that I've been through, most companies that I've been in, as that slightly adversarial conflict. We will talk about this a little bit later, but surely, when we're talking about employee relations issues, above all else, they're very emotional. The rationality kind of goes out the window at that point. How can you make a valid claim about something when somebody feels so deeply that they've been wronged in a particular way. It's very hard to be rational about it. We can be rational in many other areas, you know, even pay and benefits. You job grade and everything else, and okay, you can say it's slightly more or slightly less than it should be, or whatever else. But fundamentally, you've got an objective measure to do by it. The whole point about a grievance or a disciplinary in many cases is that somebody is emotionally brought up in this whole thing. They're wrapped up in this situation, which they feel is overwhelming them. So you almost have to deal with that more than you have to deal with whether they were right or wrong what they did.
And is there a challenge that the minute that case is raised, it becomes part of a controlled
100%.
process? So there's almost a legal perspective,
100%.
which takes the emotion out of it.
Absolutely. And in theory, it takes the emotion out, but how can it possibly do so? You know, no matter what, unless you come down on their side 100% and they feel vindicated in whatever way, in which case the other person that may be grieved against feels terrible, but it's impossible to take that emotion out of the equation. You know, they are wrapped up in it, and the whole problem is, as soon as it is literally I'm versus you, rather than trying to resolve that problem collectively in any particular way that hopefully pleases everybody. Now, that great word compromise and you know, and all the rest of it, conciliation, it sounds utopian. Fundamentally what it ends up being is everybody's not quite as unhappy as they otherwise would be, which in the world of HR is a pretty good result, you know. But managing that legal risk shouldn't be our primary concern. You know, it then becomes purely about the process and the amount of people then thinking about that process, and the manager being off work, the employee representative being off work, the employee themselves being off work, and all they're thinking about is getting the case together, getting the facts right, putting the letters in the correct format. It's all about the process and not about the person. And you know, we talk about data in HR and that dehumanizing people. This process has the real potential to dehumanize that process, the people that we're dealing with as well. And it's a real shame. And there are other ways of doing it.
That is a great point. And we're going to go to a poll in a minute. So I'm going to bring it back to the Burson model. At what point does transformation or the need to mature, at what point is it held back by exactly what you've described?
Look, I think we're in that transition point at the moment where we're not really sure where to put our energies. It seems like in the HR profession in general, there's so much out there, and so much is being, you know, expected of the profession. We're expected to deliver value. We're expected to do things in ways that we weren't in the past, which is fantastic. Because implicit in that is the trust that you are actually able to provide that value. And if you can't, you need to prove that and demonstrate that. And that's, you know, that has changed over the last 20 years or so. But implicit in that is, okay, what are we actually going to do? Where is the best way to put our value? And that's really what we're talking about today, isn't it? You know, where is the value of dealing with HR in an effective way? How can we prove that? And how can we show that it's worth not just saying handle it, but handle it in the right way?
Okay, hold that thought. We'll come back to that in a minute. I'm going to put you on the spot now. On behalf of your employer, Flybe, where would you put yourself on the Burson model? Because we're going to ask everybody that decided to join the call today to do the same in a second.
And I'm gonna cry out a little bit and say that the aviation industry in general is traditionally very traditional. It's taken quite a long time to get over some of the old hang-ups that we have. You know, the aviation is very much from a military background. Effectively, it came out of the RAF and all the rest of it, and flying was you know, we still have captains, we still have seniority, all that kind of stuff. So, and HR and many other processes have sort of followed routes. So we're still in that operational area at the moment. We are working towards that integrated talent management piece. We are working towards providing value, and there are elements where you skip levels as well, don't you? So we're hoping to be able to, you know, skip past some of these things and go straight to where is the stuff that we can provide the most value.
Okay.
Hopefully.
So you'd say you were somewhere between 2 and 3?
If we had to put it along that line, I'd say so.
Okay. So. I think for the purpose of the poll,
exactly right.
But I think that's quite a common response. So we're going to hand back to Dan, and Dan's just going to give some brief instructions on how to vote yourselves.
So brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. As you can see on your screen now, you should have the question, where is your HR function on the Burson model, which I think we can all agree is fast becoming the central way of benchmarking where you are in your HR journey. So are you at personnel department, operational HR, integrated talent management, or business-driven HR, otherwise high impact HR? Please click the option which is most relevant to yourself, and then in the next 10 seconds or so, I can see, because about 2/3 to almost 3/4 now are quoted. We'll be able to share the results with everybody, and then Ian and Rob can, see whether that tallies with what's Ian's experience in the aviation industry and what Rob sees more generally as well.
And I think it's worth pointing out that this isn't necessarily, as I tried to refer, I don't see it necessarily as a sliding scale. It's not either one thing or the other. I think I always think of it as, where do you spend the most amount of your time?
Yeah, I see that as well. I think if you look at your HR strategy, how closely aligned are the imperatives you're focusing on to the scale?
And there we go. So the results have just come in. So glad to see only 5% of people consider themselves a personnel department. I wonder if that's sort of how they think that they're viewed, or whether they feel that themselves. But it looks like the majority of people, a significant majority in that operational area. Well, there is, if you look at a distribution curve, there is a skew towards the right-hand end, which is positive.
Yes, absolutely. And the other thing that came out of the round table that we did last month was data was a huge constraint to moving up the maturity scale, and the amount of ER heads that were still managing data with spreadsheets, or data resided on various different systems that they couldn't get to. They knew what they wanted to get out of it and share with the business that would pinpoint some really good initiatives and interventions. They just couldn't get at it, so there was no evidence really to try and drive that conversation with the business.
Yeah, and we might talk about it a little bit more a little bit later. But my dual remit for my role was employee relations and insights. It may seem almost counterintuitive to put those two things together. I don't necessarily see that, because you do generate a huge amount of data just by doing employee relations. It's one of the key touch points that you have with your employees. But I'm glad we're talking about that, because it is a key interest of me. And I'd always say, don't let the data hold you back from making decisions. You may not have perfect data, but you have some.
Yep.
Start on that. Just do anything. Start doing on the low-hanging fruit, making sure that you've got some key takeaways that you can give, key actions that you can make that will have an immediate impact. And then you'll be surprised. It may be as simple as, making sure that your reporting, your scorecarding is really up to date and really effective and really gets to the point of what people want to have as an answer. Ask your CEO or your board level people, what are your issues that are keeping you up at night? How can I show you that what we're doing is providing value? And even just reformatting sometimes and making those graphs and charts more effective. All of a sudden they go, wow, that looks amazing. And so all of a sudden you've got buy-in to do something different. So start somewhere.
I fully agree with you, actually. I don't find it surprising that you've linked ER with insights. I think the two do go hand in hand, and one of the reasons that AdviserPlus has set up a data services practice is because we have some awesome policy data. We have great data about the business taken from the HR management systems, and by bringing that together, we can provide really cutting insights into attrition, into absenteeism. And as I said earlier on, it's when you start to drill down into, well, what is the cost of absenteeism, and should this be a bigger issue in my business? Should this be interesting the CFO as to how we can potentially reduce this? Because the amount of investment in temporary workers to replace, particularly in the NHS, where we've seen some case studies where return to work interviews weren't happening, and we could clearly see repeated short-term absence, continued long-term absence, and unwanted attrition was happening when return to work interviews weren't occurring in a timely way.
That's the key thing there, isn't it? So you're able not just to say absenteeism is a problem, you're able to say, okay, it's worst here. So if we want to invest to do something about it, what's going to have our biggest impact? Well, it's right there. And rather than spending, hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds on trying to fix a problem globally, you may have whole areas which don't have that problem.
Focus on the hotspot.
Exactly. And fundamentally, it comes back to the same thing. So there may be the other way around. It may be, the CFO or CEO saying, we have a problem with absenteeism. Because I think we do, because somebody said it's a problem elsewhere, or whatever, or they have it ingrained in your head, and you can drill down into those details and say, you know what, we don't have it as bad as you think we do.
No, and I think, as you describe, I think if there is that sort of intuitive response that we think there's a problem with absenteeism, then there's nothing better than getting in a room with managers saying, well, what do you think the causes are? And using those as input data that we can then correlate with the problem to look at where the sort of the influencing factors are matching up.
So coming back to your point earlier about, the lack of data being impediment, that's fundamentally up to the HR guys to get out there and find that data, and to ask for it. Some of the best data is qualitative, not quantitative. Just get out there and ask a few people. You'd be amazed at what comes out. It doesn't have to be a lot. you know, a handful of your best managers or even your worst managers saying, what are your issues? You know, it's amazing what you'll come up with.
And where it really does break through, I think, in terms of the strategy part of HR strategy is when it comes into performance. So when you can start to look at performance data, to productivity, to manager performance ratings, you can start to get a really good idea of what the right mix is between those factors that are creating great outcomes.
Absolutely. Now we're going on about data, which is great, but I think we probably need to move on to your.
We do. So when we talk about change, I think the drivers that I find typically are where there might be an element of noise coming from the business about the HR service, particularly as HR services are funded in different ways within different organisations, where there is a central levy paid into HR, which is seen as an operational cost, and a feeling that they're not getting value for money. That can sometimes cause sort of bigger issues around the executive table. The cost reduction piece that we talked about earlier on, you know, how can ER reduce costs? What are the things that they can do? What do they need visibility of that helps them make those decisions without bringing more risk onto the business? And that drive for self-service from across the business. Can managers do more? At the Gartner HR Reimagine conference a couple of months ago, there was quite a stat that shocked me that said, as automation takes hold, 2/3 of a manager's job will be spared.
Yep.
So does this actually give them more time, more focus on managing some of those employee issues and getting the best out of their people? And lastly, digitalisation. Big budgets signed off, like any investment, expected to be spent with a return on investment. How quickly can we get there? What are the constraining factors? And digitalisation in ER is something that we're seeing a lot, whether we're talking about chatbot tools, workflow automation rather, artificial intelligence and machine learning in data analytics, or just better kind of ticketing systems and management of demand. Are you seeing that pressure from those external parties in Flybe to where you are getting that challenge and you need to come back with reasons and evidence that you are looking at this?
Look, I think it's there's elements of all of those things, and it depends on what you mean by pressure.
Pressure with a small p, I think.
Yeah, well, maybe it's that, but there's certainly elements that you can see. You know, there's no secret that Flybe has had some troubled times. You know, we've been very fortunate that we've been brought up by a consortium. We're very excited about our transformation that we're going through to become Virgin Connect early next year, which will be very, very exciting. Cost is inevitably a big part of that. You know, we're looking at every single way possible, and every company is, you know, of managing and ensuring that we're getting the best value for money. And I think there's a key difference necessarily between reducing cost and that value for money element. You know, one of the key elements that Mark Anderson, our CEO, was talking about is, you know, we're not necessarily thinking about low cost. You know, we're not trying to compete with EasyJet, Ryanair. We're talking about value. We're talking about, you know, making sure that every single pound that people spend, they get really good value for, whether that's our customers or whether that's the business for our employees and vice versa. So, you know, we need to sit there and think, okay, if we need to spend 60, 80, 100,000 pounds on a particular piece of tech for this year, why do we need it? What is it going to really do? How is it going to fundamentally transform our business? And looking at that digitalization piece, are we getting that longer term so that it's manageable and usable in 5-10 years time? And how does that more importantly integrate into the other systems that we've got going on? Or are we adding just more complexity into an already ridiculously complex system? So, you know, that HR dissatisfaction piece, I think, yeah, it depends on the size of your company and how much HR gets blamed for something, or for blockages, or for whatever else you want to call it. Sometimes it's just as amorphous, the company. And HR just happens to be the face of it sometimes, and
That's very common.
IT sometimes happens to be the face of it. Finance happens to be the face of it. We can't do it because the CFO, the bean counters, you know, whatever you want to call that. There is an element of saying, you know, we're not being allowed to achieve all we can achieve, and HR, not surprisingly, cuts a little bit of slack for that. So it's all about managing that process in between, you know, providing that great experience, and as you say, managing that ongoing risk. And the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
No.
And getting that early enough in that process in terms of managing those ER processes does wonders, not only for that dissatisfaction piece and that stuff that we've already talked about in terms of, you know, that emotional element to it, but also reducing costs. You know, the amount of times and, you know, just in terms of management time that you can save by making sure that it stays at the informal level, for example, rather than taking it to a formal level, is huge.
Yeah.
And so much of that can be done by thinking again proactively and getting ahead of the curve on that stuff.
Excellent. I think we're going to go to another poll now, just to get a feel from the audience's experience of where are they finding that internal pressure with a small p in employee relations from their internal stakeholders.
So as Rob just laid out, the 4 options there are: is it pressure to reduce cost, increase your manager ownership, is it digitalisation or digital transformation processes, or dissatisfaction from the HR function itself? So I'll leave that up there for another 10 seconds or so, give you all a chance to have your say, and then put it to Ian and Rob again. So I can see that most of you have voted. So if I share those results now, and it is increased manager ownership, although not
by much. Yeah.
It's a big play there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk a bit more about cost reduction later on, because you know it's a challenge. And actually, if we move into the next area, sort of what is the CEO's view of ER? And I'm going to be slightly provocative here. I mean, the CEOs that I speak with when talking about transactional HR, the feedback I normally get, it's the hygiene factor. It's the stuff that I know that happens, but it happens under the surface. I know it needs to happen, but I don't need to know how it happens. I want my HR director to be more director and less HR. So, you know, the corporate voice of the people that are going to help me enable and deliver my my strategy. The other area that came out is it's there to enable the business, and the minute it starts to constrain the business, and this is something that you know we find probably more often than you would think, where employee relations believes that it's doing the right thing in chasing managers, trying to move to that next step of the process that you talked about earlier on, trying to stay compliant. But managers, for whatever reason, get dragged into this level of complexity. And for whatever reason, they don't have the capability or the confidence to be able to apply, even in that sort of reactive role, what's required. Is there a big job to do for employee relations to work with managers and help them understand different instances and profiles of activity that are going to come to them, and give them the capability to understand how they can do it?
Look, fundamentally, I don't disagree with any of that. I certainly don't disagree with the CEO, hypothetical CEO that you mentioned earlier, in terms of the hygiene element. You know, if an ER case crosses a CEO's desk, there's a real problem. You know, why is the CEO being asked to look at these kinds of issues? How has it come to light? It could be a strike, it could be anything major like that, of course, but it could be much simpler than that. And you know, sending emails direct to the CEO, whatever else. These things happen all the time in many different organizations, and if he becomes aware of it somewhere along the chain, something's gone wrong. To your larger point in terms of that, the sort of manager enablement piece. And to tie it in with what you said earlier about that 2/3 of a manager's job potentially might disappear through automation in the future. It's been a long-standing HR concern in terms of promoting people to managers' positions that are there to manage and not necessarily for what the skills they had before. And you can look at Gallup, Strength Finder, you can look at any kind of polls that have happened over the last 15, 20 years to say, why should we be promoting people just because they're good at the job at the moment? It's a standard, you know, promotion fallacy that you have, that they're good at what they currently do, so they're going to be good managers. Rubbish, frankly. And it's HR's job to make sure that we are hiring and putting people into management positions that are good managers. And they may not necessarily be the best people at their current jobs. So the whole structure, and this is not just an ER area, this is very much a people function, looking at competencies for managers. You know, what are the skills and leadership criteria that we need to have that's in line with our culture, the company culture, but more importantly, in line with how we manage the teams that are working for us better. And it's inevitable that having those right people in place there, they will automatically have the skills and the capabilities and everything else to a certain degree that will help that. Now, can HR do more to encourage that? Of course we can. You know, there's so many trainings that we can do. There's so many sitting down and literally sort of coaching them through these programs that we can do. But fundamentally, we need to start right from the very beginning and say, who are these people that we're putting into those management positions? Do they have the skills and the personality and the capability to manage other people in a way that we need them to in the first place? Otherwise, there's literally no point in this. You can do all the training till the cows come home. They're either not going to listen, or they're not going to take it in, or they're not going to be able to put that into practice. Or more, quite often what happens is they'll get dragged into the weeds and they'll be purely operational. And they'll get dragged into the stuff that effectively that they shouldn't be doing.
And where that falls short sometimes, I mean, is how well positioned is that to the understanding, interpretation, communication, and management of policy? I think that's the first thing. I think, in terms of AdviserPlus, we sort of never set out to build a training business, but when you outsource your employee relations to AdviserPlus, it's really important that the managers understand where AdviserPlus fits into the equation and what's expected of them. Secondly, like many ER functions, AdviserPlus has always been led by customers to adopt a coaching style. So this isn't about telling managers what they need to do. It's helping them understand what they need to do, where they need greater levels of support. And thirdly, at the round table, one of the very interesting bits of feedback we had is, oh no, we believe it is ER's job to train the managers in that understanding, interpretation, management and communication of policy. To where there was a debate, wasn't there, in terms of, well, what are organisation development doing? What are learning and development are doing? What are recruitment doing? Ensuring those managers have got the right skills at that time. Now, I'm not asking you to solve that problem, as you said. It's felt across many organisations, but how do you even start trying to make sense of how big that problem is and the kind of things that you can do to fix it?
You know what? I'm torn in between having a very prescriptive system. So you say literally, here is the process, follow it to the T, checkbox exercise, and you're never going to go wrong. To the complete extreme, and just say, here are your basic principles. Adhere to those basic principles, and again, you're not likely to go too far wrong. The first method is as sure as you're possibly going to get. Now, is everybody going to literally follow those things? Sometimes people go, you know what, I haven't even looked at that. I haven't seen it. It's too complicated. I'm not going to bother with that. I don't work in that way. So they're going to do their own thing anyway. So I'm really torn in between those two ways of thinking. I'm fundamentally erring much more towards that simplistic approach and saying, look, here are our core principles. And anyone that has any familiarity with ER and ACAS and everything else, it's all about fair and reasonableness, right? So we're talking about treat your process fairly, treat this employee fairly, approach the whole situation reasonably, put yourself in their shoes. They're not doing it to spite you, or maybe they are, I don't know, maybe it's vindictive, who knows. But 99 times out of 100, they're doing it out of a serious concern or a genuine belief or a request. Think about flexible working and everything else, the processes that quite often ER handles. They're doing it because they want to enhance their work-life balance or whatever else that might be. There's only so much that, again, we can say you've got to stick to 42-day limits, you've got to stick to with 7-day timelines. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, if anybody comes down to question that particular process or that particular decision, they're going to look at, was it fair and reasonable? Did you treat these people in a systematic way? Were you consistent? Did you do something differently for one person from the other? That's basic management. This isn't necessarily about following a process. This is literally, how would you like to be treated yourself? And it's management 101. It really is. And that could be management of your own internal processes. If you're an operational person, if you're a sales manager, you wouldn't treat your customers fundamentally differently. Why would you treat your employees fundamentally differently?
Interesting. I think that's a very interesting perspective. And I would say that my experience is that balance or that perspective hasn't been realised in most cases.
I agree.
I think we should probably mention digitalisation here as well in terms of digital tools. So in order to get that consistency and standardisation of quality when managers are dealing with particular cases, sometimes the policies on the shared drive written in legalese, again, is constraining for them to be able to do their job properly. Digitalisation frees them up to be able to interpret situations in simulated environments, how-to videos, rather than looking at policies. They can actually follow a workflow. That makes their life easier. And is that something that HR can do to really help them?
Does it really make it easier, or is it, again, just a box-ticking exercise? Do they rely on that so much that they can't even think about what you're fundamentally doing? You know, at that point, again, it comes back to that point I was making earlier. You're following a process. You're treating a process. You're not treating the person. Every person, every case is going to be slightly different. You know, do you need to follow every single step of that process, or can you just literally sit down and have a quiet chat and resolve that problem much more simply than you would any other way? You know, it seems simple to have a customized, straightforward, strategic process, step by step, which is fail-safe. Processes, by their very definition, aren't always fail-safe. They go wrong along the way. I'm personally of the opinion that it's much better to have people that are people in management positions and being able to think about the best way to address a situation at the same time.
Selection of the right managers, give them the skills to do the job, and have some resources where they need support on more complex cases.
Fundamentally, of course, look, HR, legal, whoever else are the experts in theory in this realm, so we're always going to be there to be able to answer particularly tricky situations. But I'd much prefer the whole give a man a fishing rod kind of scenario, where you're giving them the tools to be able to manage the processes and people themselves in a realistic, reasonable way, and to have the confidence
rather than them relying on HR to give them those skills. And the next slide, I think, is quite interesting, and this came from the Gartner conference again. Provocative, as I like to be sometimes. HR leaders need to ask themselves, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. Is that a viable strategy, or is it a fear of change?
Yes. Look, it can be a viable strategy. It can be a case of, look, pick the areas where you're going to get the most added value. You know, the CHRO's job, Chief People Officer's job, is so wide-ranging and such a huge remit these days that they really need to focus on the areas that are going to provide the most impact to the business. So fundamentally, you know, if the policies are more or less working at the moment, don't go around changing them. You know, think about the areas where you're really going to provide the best value. So in those kinds of situations, I can have some sympathy for that. It really is about picking your fights and picking your battles. However, the fear of change is real. You know, you mentioned talking about agile and the future of work. We've had that discussion already. The world of work and everything else is changing so fundamentally and so rapidly. The gig economy, you know, zero contract hours, a horrible term, but fundamentally the way people approach tasks and skills and work is different now, and it will continue to change. So we need to have those strategies ready in place for that to move forward in the future. So there is an element of saying, I don't know how to approach this, but almost a case of change something and see what happens. Don't be frightened of experimenting and seeing what happens. The worst thing that can happen is that you unwind it and go back to what you did before. But again, if you treat people fairly and reasonably, it's not like, you know, we want to change the engine configuration on an aircraft without testing it. You know, people are, as long as they get paid and they get treated reasonably, they're pretty flexible and pretty reasonable about these things.
And the other element to that statement is, how often do HR really go out and seek the answer to, is it broken? Do people want improvement? Are we delivering what we need to? But which brings me on to the second provocative statement. We work with a number of management consultants, as you can probably imagine, that are leading the broader HR transformation, which brings assessment of value chains and systems thinking and Six Sigma and Lean and real process transformation capability and sophistication. And quite often it gets levied at me that the ER is processing waste. These are non-value added activities. If these could have been dealt with by a manager at source, we would, reduce our cases by 80%, and if our policies were clearer, and it's all about what happens upstream. Do you relate to that?
Look, I do to a large degree, and I do to the extent that that's often how it's handled, dealt with in a large number of organizations, certainly in the numbers, the organizations that I've worked in. It needn't be, but that certainly is often how it's perceived and how it's handled. So again, it comes back to, if this is crossing my desk, it's a piece of garbage, I don't want to deal with it. You know, the CEO shouldn't be thinking about these things, and it's a case of somebody else manage that. I don't want to see it, out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. But again, I don't think it has to be that way. If we, again, fundamentally, employee relations, ER, is about the relations between the employer and the employee. That involves all of those touch points that we talked about. If you talk, and I come from a service background, if you talk about every single service touch point that you talk about as an opportunity to influence how they view you and how you view that, they review that relationship, ER is no different. In fact, it has many more opportunities to be able to do that. And we'll talk about that a little bit in terms of what that means on a day-to-day basis. Because if, you know, I had a fantastic example of this as part of our transformation program. We had somebody from our customer, from Virgin's customer experience team, come and give us a talk as part of our leadership kickoff day not long ago with Flybe, and they were talking about this amazing example where there was a disruption. One of the planes was delayed, landing, I can't remember, or taking off, I can't remember which one. And it wasn't delayed by much, it was delayed by 20-30 minutes, something like that. But automatically, and they have this incredibly intricate, granular level of detail in terms of how much they view that's a net promoter score, and the impact that that has on it. And it went from a pretty decent score down to -20, literally without one disruption. Not a major disruption, just a minor disruption. So you start off on a minus, that person could have left with a -20 score, you know, terrible experience, might not ever go back to Virgin, etc., etc. One announcement from the Virgin pilot on that plane swung that around completely. And he basically just gave them a story about, you know, how that happened, what the likely implications were, the fact that, you know, it was weather related, and it was just giving them information. And that net promoter score went from a complete, it was a 40-point swing. It went from -20 to +20, just from that one thing. I see ER in almost exactly the same way. So if you think about employee net promoter score, we don't track that at the moment, but a lot of companies do, or starting to. And every opportunity along that way, every grievance, every slight niggle that they have with the company, everything else, or in a colleague or anything else, they have that opportunity to say, something's not working right for me here. That is an opportunity for the company to turn that around, to recover that. At the moment, their employee net promoter score might be -20 because they're a bit annoyed by their current situation. Here is your chance now to resolve it effectively, quickly, professionally, in a way that satisfies as many people as possible, or at least doesn't dissatisfy them that much. And all of a sudden, whoomph, not only have you wiped out that minus score, you've actually gone plus because you've handled it in a professional way. We're talking about that return on investment. There's your return on investment right there. Having good ER processes and employee relations and that mindset of that service delivery mindset is fundamental to being able to see this in ER in a completely different way.
And that's critical to quality.
It is.
And that's, you know, understanding where an intervention like that has such a disproportionate upside. It's very helpful data for you to have. I think before we finish on the process element, lots of the audience were talking about cost savings as being their biggest issue, and I do tend to veer towards the sort of the process and systems area. It's really important as well, I think, to have full visibility of the data, of the demand that is coming into your ER function in terms of cases and activity. You know, what volume of cases, what's the profile, how do you rank complexity? And that will start to give you an idea, I think, of your investment in time in different types of cases and how you can remove the non-complex cases and be comfortable that they could be dealt with upstream at source by the manager, versus those that will need somebody who is a professional that is able to take the professional legal view around employment law.
And a good triage system, whether that's automated or manual, is fundamental to that. You know, whether you use ServiceNow or use something similar, or you literally just judge things as they come through, depending on the size of your organization. Really, really important.
Excellent. Right. So I think we're going to go into probably quite a quick fire element here. When we talk about employee relations and industrial relations, things are changing.
They are.
You know, unions are, I think, certainly the membership volumes are hugely down year on year. employees that behave in a collectivist manner is increasing. The ability to be able to harness opinions and support using social media in particular. This is potentially going to create a bit of a challenge for organizations. How do you see that?
Look, it's a funny one. Again, aviation is one of the last sort of bastions of the traditional trade union relationship, for all its sins and all its benefits. But that doesn't mean that industrial relations itself is dying out. The way I see this, frame this question is, that individual or that personal versus collective. And it depends what you mean by that collective. Does it literally mean, okay, let's view one store or one outlet or one branch or anything else as a collective entity? How do we treat them? And also, or is it this drive towards the personal employee experience? Everyone's collecting more data about employees and about our customers to be able to provide those personalized benefits. I see that as a fundamental dichotomy. How do we still treat people individually and yet still treat people fairly on a consistent collective basis? So I'm struggling with this. It's one of those things where you have to think about things. Okay, we've got a lot of pilots, obviously, we've got a lot of cabin crew, we've got a lot of engineers. Fundamentally, they all do very, very similar jobs, and yet they're still, sounds like something out of Life of Brian, they're all individuals. And so how do we create something which was a bespoke value-added service for an individual and yet still treat them fairly consistently across the board? If we want to raise our pay or change our benefits or fundamentally alter our relationship between us and our cabin crew or pilots, how do we do that and still individually engage and enhance?
So your view is, if you look after the people in a fair manner, then the unions shouldn't really present too much of a challenge.
Look, in theory, that's the old adage of how to handle trade unions and how to try and handle industrial relations. Is fundamentally they may be union members, but they're still employees, and treat them in the right way. They might not need to necessarily go to trade unions. I've worked with trade unions for long enough to know that they can be of a huge benefit. Rather than dealing with thousands of individuals, you can deal with one or one group of people. And if they speak well and speak on behalf of their members in a fair and consistent way, it's so much more simple, and it allows for quite creative thinking, potentially. It doesn't always work out that way, obviously, but in theory, that relationship is there. And it's, it may not necessarily be a recognized trade union. You may have works council, you have, an employee who speaks up on behalf of his team members. Whatever that is, it shouldn't be overlooked, and it shouldn't be dismissed as a tool to say, I'm not interested in dealing with trade unions, I'm not interested in dealing with industrial relations. It can be incredibly beneficial, but that whole fundamental mentality of how do I treat these people collectively and yet still approach the employee experience in an individual way, that still needs to be worked out. I think it's a fascinating question. I don't have an answer, but I think it's something that everyone
your opinion is very interesting, and I'm sure those that are already working with trade unions will have an opinion on that as well. But quite interesting to see with the decline of union membership, how prominent is that in the marketplace. So I think, Dan, we're going to do another quick poll.
So there you can see on the screens now that do you have a registered trade union in your business that you have to deal with, and just a simple yes or no there. So are you like Ian, or are you not like Ian, for example?
I'm not going to take that personally, Dan.
And I think the next question, what is the people risk and impact on the company? We've already covered, but looking at that,
it's actually higher than I thought, to be honest. I find that quite interesting. I think you'll have better stats than I will in terms of the overall membership, but I know that it's declined significantly over the last sort of 40 odd years. Now, maybe people are expecting that not necessarily to just be trade unions, but any kind of collective responsibility or collective talking. I don't know. But
next question, very quickly. How do you effectively enable managers?
Yep. I think we've more or less sort of covered a lot of these topics before. I think it really is a case of, for me, giving them the freedom to make those decisions, but making sure that we have the right people in the place in the first place. So much emphasis can be put on, we really don't want to let this get out of control. And so therefore we're going to handhold and make sure this process doesn't fall foul, so we end up at an employee tribunal. That first mindset is, we don't want to spend anything in an employee tribunal, let's make sure we get this right. Fundamentally, that's not wrong. That's not wrong for the business. We have to manage that risk. We have to make sure that we do everything we can. But fundamentally, that whole mentality, I think, needs to shift away to, you know what, in order for this for not only our employees to trust the company better, but our managers to trust the company better, we need to give them some autonomy to be able to manage the people in the way that they see fit.
I think we should do another one of these sessions on that subject, because I think there's an hour's worth of content there, and I'm just again thinking, where's the starting point? Where are people on their journey? And because it isn't just ER, it cuts across, you know, OD and learning and development and resourcing.
Yep.
You know, what are the individual roles, and how do you actually say, right, that's the strategy. What does good look like, and what are the actions that we're going to take to be able to deliver that? We're going to go to another quick poll. Dan, do you want to introduce the question?
So, have you moved away from a formal grievance process to a resolution or conflict handling policy? Yes, no, or I guess the third one there is we're on the journey towards it, so it's kind of in our pipeline. So again, I will leave it up for a few seconds. I can see that most of you have voted, so if I share those with Robin here as well. So overwhelmingly, no.
Yeah, and I find that not altogether unsurprising. I'm glad to see that some have, who are sort of 24%, so 1/4 I've got it, or they're considering it. We're certainly at Flybe in the process of going down that route, and I don't see that as a conflict of interest between that managing risk element. I just see that as managing it earlier in the process and dealing with the emotions of the issue, and not necessarily just the process of the issue. And this came about through, as I said, the Virgin Atlantic's policy, which we're looking at for Virgin Connect as well. They have a quite well developed sort of conflict resolution process, talking about mediation, talking about conciliation. There's some really good models out there, and objective reasons why fundamentally there's a great return on this investment. You know, being able to nip things in the bud in an informal process and resolving the issues on an emotional level, which is way more. Think about this. Think about the number of times, if you're an ER manager, getting to the end of the process, and you know that whatever the outcome is, even if you found in their favor, that somebody's going to be unhappy about this, that they're still not satisfied with it. And the amount of emotional stress, maybe they've even gone off sick because they've had stress related to this, it cannot be worth it. You know, fundamentally, to think about these terms in such adversarial ways.
Yeah. No, I agree, and again, I think, you know, that transition from formal grievance process to mediation, I think, was again a very interesting subject to explore in greater detail. What role does technology play? I think we've covered that in the broader conversation about the future of ER. And I think just finally, where can ER prove return on investment, and is it possible? And how tenuous are those links between ER activities and investment and some of those wider business priorities and deliverables?
And look, and this is a model that I think every HR practitioner should have in mind. And this is the HR value chain. It's not a brand new model. It's been around for a little while, but the concept behind it is really fundamental. And we can either think about it in terms of process, you can think about it in terms of data and analytics, but fundamentally, this is how any support function, whether that's HR, finance, or IT, can really look at the levers that they have. So the levers are on the left-hand side. They will drive some outcomes which might be in the middle, which in turn will drive organizational impact. Now, fundamentally, if you're looking at profit, you're looking at turnover, you're looking at productivity, you're looking at quality, customer satisfaction, those are the things that matter to a CEO and a CFO. They don't really care how we get there. Fundamentally, you as an HR professional are there to show them how employee engagement, how your performance, how your talent metrics, all those workforce costs drive those impacts, those business impacts.
So would you say the effectiveness elements are quantitative measures?
They can easily be
efficiency more qualitative.
Look, there's a huge amount of literature out there already in terms of showing how much engagement, 1 percentage point rise in engagement will drive your profitability or your revenue streams. There's a huge amount of data there already. That doesn't mean that you can't go out and reprove it again with your own stats and your own data. But fundamentally, we only have a limited amount of tools. So the way I see this is on your left-hand side, you say, well, look, we have these tools at our disposal. They should, in theory, drive those things in the middle, which in theory will have the impact on the top there. You can provide those links fairly straightforwardly. There's a lot of literature out there which has already done a lot of the hard work. But you'll see that fourth point down on the left-hand side, industrial relations, so call that employee relations, industrial relations. That has a direct impact, and again, there's literature on this, on employee engagement, on your retention or your absenteeism, and you can easily show that they have a big impact then on your productivity, on your quality, on your profitability, and your customer satisfaction.
And you've got some great data analytics tools, you can see that correlation
Absolutely.
in terms of your return on investment from your workforce.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Ian, thank you very much for today. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for sharing your views and also what's going on at Flybe at the moment. It's always good, I think, to leave with a few takeaways. And yeah, we've prepared this beforehand. It's not new to you. But the three key takeaways that Ian and I have discussed is, firstly, is that narrative on how employee relations supports the business strategy. And I think you can use the HR impact standards that you just went through. But also being really clear about roles and responsibilities. As you said earlier on, sometimes ER is tarred with a brush that it's not accountable for. And having that open communication flow with the business so they very clearly understand what ER does and what it should be delivering can help remove that from the equation. Secondly, your operating model. Get a really granular understanding of your operating model. Understand the demand that's coming into the function, how many activities people are doing, when we have good outcomes, when we have not so good outcomes, how you define the demand that's coming in. What are the different dimensions? Who is driving that demand? All of that is very helpful in helping you recognize the cost envelope, if you like, for the employee relations function. And then I think also be prepared to go to the business and ask, how are we doing? Put some metrics in place. Are we performing against them? Take any ambiguity or subjectivity out of the equation. And again, try and ensure that there is a common view of value and how you're performing against it. And I think, one of the things you talked in detail about, which I found very interesting and not as widespread as you might think, is about that employee experience. How can you deliver a great employee experience if you do have a very, very process-driven case management approach within employee relations?
Absolutely.
And better managers who are recruited well to great competency frameworks and supported by great leadership.
And have that experience mindset, thinking about how that every interaction between yourself and your employee has a potential to impact how they view you and how they view the business.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ian. We've overrun slightly, but there's still a few people on the line. Are there any questions, Dan?
I will come through now. So we have had a few questions. I think I'm going to do on the party group and say that I'm going to only put one to you guys because we have run over. But
can we reply in writing to them?
Well, I think the last slide actually is your details, isn't it? So I'm going to suggest actually that if Rob puts that slide up now, then if there are any questions about solutions and further questions you have on this matter, then you can see Rob's email address is up there, and that's probably the most suitable person.
Yeah, and I can liaise with Ian as well, and we can come back with a sort of joint response on that.
I think one of them was about manager capability, and on this ER journey, and it's one that's come through a lot on the Q&A again and again, is how central is manager capability to driving ER transformation?
I'd say it's probably number one from my personal experience. If you're relying upon ER and HR to manage ER, it sounds silly, then there's something fundamentally not quite going right here. But again, for me, it comes down to making sure that you have that you're selecting those managers on core competencies and having those core competencies correct in the first place. And partly that's recruitment and partly that's training and leadership development. So all of those things we talked about breaking down those silos. For me, fundamentally, if managers aren't thinking about their employees and their team in general, at least as much, if not more, than their actual job that they're doing, that they're supposed to be doing on an operational level, again, something is going wrong.
Yeah, and I would agree, and I think the progressive HR leaders of the last 15 years that have made the decision to outsource employee relations, I think the AdviserPlus coaching style was probably quite a big element of that. It isn't low-level HR administrators looking at a screen with ACAS policies on. It's experienced HR practitioners that are allowing that judgment interpretation and encouraging mediation, encouraging conversations with great confidence on the advice that they're giving, empowers the manager to be able to go and do that and takes maybe their fear of risk away from doing so. But, again, I'd be really interested in the audience's response to, would they be interested in something that does explore the role of the line manager and the capability in helping drive that employee relations transformation. I think that'd be a very interesting subject matter.
That's a webinar topic all on its own.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I do think it is, and it was the same at the round table. It wasn't where we thought it was going to go, but everybody said our role is empowering managers.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Rob. That is actually, we've got to end there, so sorry, guys. But as Rob said, his email address is there, robwilliams@adviserplus.com. Even if you want to put something to Ian as well, you can go through Rob.
Absolutely, and I'm very grateful for everybody tuning in. I hope you found it useful, and once again, our thanks to Dan and to Ian for your contribution.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. So thank you very much. Thank you all for attending. We will be sending this out afterwards, so please check out that email in your inbox, and have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.